How dare you cause such a scene? Let go of her at once!
She is staying right where she is. You may leave if you wish.
Please, I must go.
Whispers echoed through the grand ballroom of Oakhaven Manor long before the clock struck 12. Society insisted a duke must marry royalty, but Aloysius Gonzalez had no interest in blue blood. He wanted the penniless girl hiding in the shadows, and heaven help anyone who stood in his way. To understand how Charlie Stanton found herself standing in the drafty, gilded corridors of Oakhaven Manor, one had to look back to the devastating autumn of 1882. London's financial district had seen many ruins, but the collapse of the Stanton Shipping Company was a spectacle of high tragedy. Charlie's father, Richard Stanton, had been a merchant of immense wealth and unyielding integrity. He had made only one fatal error in his 60 years of life. He trusted a gentleman of the aristocracy. Lord Henry Ashford had convinced Richard to heavily invest in a colonial railway venture, only to abscond with the capital, leaving the Stanton family to face the creditors. The shock stopped Richard's heart within a fortnight. The bank seized their townhouse on Grosvenor Square, auctioned their mahogany furniture, and left 20-year-old Charlie entirely destitute. In the unforgiving hierarchy of Victorian society, a ruined merchant's daughter was a social pariah. Charlie had the education of a duchess, fluent in French and Italian, an accomplished pianist, and fiercely intelligent, but she possessed the bank account of a scullery maid. Desperation drove her to the only respectable avenue left. She became a paid companion. Her employer was Lady Bianca Morris, the eldest daughter of the Earl of Westmoreland. Bianca was 24, widely considered a great beauty, and possessed a heart as cold and sharp as cut glass. The Morris family was deeply in debt, living on credit and the sheer bluff of their ancient name. Bianca's entire existence hinged on securing a profoundly wealthy husband during the 1884 season, and she viewed Charlie not as a human being, but as a deeply necessary, if highly irritating, piece of furniture. Charlie's job was to fetch shawls, mend torn lace in the dark of carriages, agree with every cruel observation Bianca made, and, most importantly, remain entirely invisible. The stakes reached a fever pitch in late June when the golden-edged invitation arrived at the Morris townhouse. Aloysius Gonzalez, the Duke of Harrington, was hosting a midsummer ball at his ancestral Berkshire estate, Oakhaven Manor. The Duke had been absent from England for 5 years, having retreated to Vienna following a tragic scandal involving his late older brother's fatal duel. Now, Aloysius had returned to assume the title. He was 30 years old, possessing an unencumbered fortune that produced over £100,000 a year, and he was unmarried. To the ambitious mothers and desperate daughters of the ton, he was the ultimate prize. For 3 weeks, the Morris household was a war zone of silk, tulle, and shattered nerves. Modistes arrived at all hours. Bianca ordered 6 new gowns on a line of credit her father could ill afford, throwing fits of rage when the beadwork was not entirely to her liking. Charlie slept no more than 3 hours a night, her fingers calloused and bleeding from emergency alterations, her ears ringing from Bianca's constant verbal abuse. "You will wear the gray poplin, Charlie," Bianca commanded on the afternoon of their departure to Berkshire. She was inspecting her own reflection in the looking-glass, admiring the way her sapphire blue silk brought out the cold ice of her eyes. "The gray poplin is frayed at the hem, my lady," Charlie murmured, keeping her head bowed as she packed Bianca's endless array of corsets into a leather trunk. "If I might wear the modest black bombazine, you will wear the gray," Bianca snapped, whirling around. "Black implies tragedy, and I will not have his Grace's mood soured by my companion, looking like a mourning crow. The gray makes you look dull. It makes you look like a servant, which, lest you forget your place since your father died a disgraced pauper, is exactly what you are." Charlie swallowed the sharp retort that burned the back of her throat. She focused on the brass latch of the trunk, forcing her breathing to steady. Survival, she reminded herself. Just survive the season. The journey to Oakhaven Manor took 4 grueling hours in a swaying carriage. When they finally rolled up the sprawling oak-lined driveway, Charlie could not help but press her face briefly against the chilled glass of the carriage window. Oakhaven was not merely a house, it was a limestone palace, glowing with the light of 3,000 beeswax candles. The architecture was wildly imposing, a masterpiece of Palladian design with sweeping colonnades and massive arched windows that spilled golden light onto the manicured lawns. As the footman handed Bianca down from the carriage, Charlie followed behind, carrying a heavy velvet cloak, a spare pair of dancing slippers, and a silver flask of smelling salts. She was a ghost in faded gray, stepping into a world that had violently cast her out. The sheer scale of the Duke of Harrington's ball was meant to intimidate, and it succeeded flawlessly. The grand ballroom was a cavern of mirrors, gilded frescoes, and sweeping marble staircases. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive Parisian perfumes, hothouse lilies, and the heavy musk of burning wax. A 50-piece orchestra played a sweeping Strauss waltz from a raised mahogany balcony. The moment they breached the receiving line, Bianca abandoned Charlie. "Stand near the terrace doors," Bianca hissed over her shoulder, snapping her fan open. "Hold my cloak. Do not eat anything. Do not speak to anyone. And if my hem tears, you had better be ready with a needle before anyone notices. Do not move from that spot." Charlie took her post by the drafty French doors. For 2 hours, she stood in the shadows, watching the glittering aristocracy spin across the floor. She saw the people who had once dined at her father's table, men who had smoked Richard Stanton's cigars, and women who had complimented Charlie's piano playing. Now they looked right through her. It was a unique kind of psychological torture, being erased while still drawing breath. By 11 o'clock, the heat in the ballroom became oppressive, and the ache in Charlie's feet was unbearable. Bianca was currently monopolizing the Earl of Rutledge on the far side of the room, her eyes darting frantically in search of the Duke, who had been noticeably absent from the floor for the past hour. Needing just 5 minutes of respite, Charlie slipped backward through the heavy velvet curtains and stepped out onto the stone terrace. The cool Berkshire night air was a shock to her lungs. Seeking absolute isolation, she wandered down a winding gravel path illuminated by hanging lanterns, finding herself at the entrance of Oakhaven's legendary botanical glasshouse. It was a magnificent crystal pavilion, heated by unseen iron pipes and filled with the dense, humid scent of damp earth and exotic flora. Charlie slipped inside, exhaling a long, ragged breath. She let Bianca's heavy velvet cloak slide from her aching arms onto a wrought iron bench. For the first time in weeks, Charlie allowed her shoulders to drop. She reached up, massaging her temples, and closed her eyes, listening to the gentle drip of condensation falling from the glass ferns. "They are rather suffocating, aren't they?" Charlie gasped, spinning around. Standing in the deep shadow of a massive date palm was a man. He was dressed in impeccable, stark black evening wear, devoid of the flashy medals or colorful sashes favored by the older peers. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite sharp jaw, straight nose, and dark, brooding eyes that held an unmistakable weariness. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, swirling it slowly. I apologize, sir," Charlie stammered, frantically reaching for Bianca's cloak, intending to flee. "I did not mean to intrude. I was just hiding," the man finished, stepping slightly out of the shadows. The moonlight caught his face, revealing a distinct silver scar cutting through the edge of his left eyebrow, adding a dangerous edge to his otherwise aristocratic features. "Do not apologize. I am hiding as well. The ambient temperature in that ballroom is currently rivaling the seventh circle of hell, and the conversation is considerably worse." Despite her panic, a small, genuine laugh escaped Charlie's lips. She quickly covered her mouth with her hand, horrified by her breach of decorum. The stranger's dark eyes locked onto hers, a flicker of genuine interest sparking in his gaze. "You disagree? Perhaps you found Lady Jersey's 20-minute monologue on the breeding lineage of her spaniels to be riveting?" "I am afraid I missed the spaniel discourse, sir," Charlie said, keeping her voice low. She knew she should leave immediately. If Bianca found her speaking to a gentleman alone in the dark, she would be dismissed without a character reference and left to starve in the streets. But there was something deeply anchoring about this man's presence. He did not look at her faded gray dress with disdain. He just looked at her. "You are fortunate," he murmured, taking a slow sip of his drink. He stepped closer, his gaze drifting to the delicate white flower blooming on the vine near Charlie's shoulder. "The Epiphyllum oxypetalum," he noted softly, "the queen of the night. It blooms only once a year, always in the dark, and dies before the morning sun can touch it. Charlie looked at the fragile, luminous white petals. A tragic existence, she observed quietly. To spend all your energy preparing for a single moment, only to be destroyed by the daylight. Or a brilliant one, he countered, his deep voice vibrating in the quiet greenhouse. To refuse to perform for the crowd in the harsh sun, choosing instead to reveal your beauty only to those willing to seek you out in the dark. He looked back at Charlie, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath hitch. It was an incredibly intimate observation. "You have a profound knowledge of botany, sir," Charlie deflected, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I spent 5 years in Austria," he replied, a shadow crossing his face. "When one wishes to avoid people, one tends to find comfort in things that cannot speak." He tilted his head, studying her. "I know the face of nearly every fortune hunter, gossip, and sycophant in that ballroom. Yet, I do not know you. You are entirely devoid of diamonds. You wear a dress meant to make you vanish, and you have the tired eyes of someone carrying a weight far heavier than a velvet cloak." Charlie stiffened, her defensive walls slamming back into place. "I am nobody of consequence, sir." "I severely doubt that." He took another step closer, placing his glass on a nearby stone plinth. "Who are you?" "I am expected back," Charlie said quickly, grabbing the cloak. Panic clawed at her throat. This man was too observant, too dangerous. "Enjoy the silence, sir." She turned and fled the glass pavilion, her worn slippers crunching softly against the gravel. She did not look back, completely unaware that Aloysius Gonzalez, the Duke of Harrington, was watching her disappear into the night, his heart beating with a strange, fierce rhythm it had not felt in years. Charlie slipped back through the terrace doors just as the grandfather clock in the grand hall chimed 1/4 to midnight. She took her place by the drafty window, her hands trembling as she draped Bianca's cloak over her arm. "Where have you been?" Bianca hissed, appearing suddenly from the crowd, her face flushed with furious color. She grabbed Charlie's wrist, her nails digging painfully into Charlie's skin. "I needed my fan 10 minutes ago." "I apologize, my lady. I felt faint." "I do not pay you to feel faint." Bianca spat, releasing her wrist with a violent shove. "This entire night is a disaster. The Duke has barely shown his face. He danced once with the Duchess of Marlborough out of duty, and has spent the rest of the evening vanishing like a phantom. It is nearly midnight." The midnight waltz. It was the unspoken climax of the evening. Tradition at Oakhaven dictated that the Duke would choose a partner for the midnight waltz, and that choice would signal his romantic intentions for the season. The tension in the ballroom was palpable. Mothers were violently shoving their daughters toward the center of the floor, arranging their skirts, and desperately trying to catch the eye of the man who held the power to elevate a family to the highest echelons of power. Suddenly, the orchestra ceased playing. The loud hum of conversation died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, expectant silence. At the top of the grand marble staircase, the Duke of Harrington appeared. Charlie, standing on her tiptoes at the very back of the room, felt the blood drain entirely from her face. The man standing at the top of the stairs, radiating a quiet, absolute authority, was the brooding stranger from the glass pavilion. Aloysius's gaze swept over the sea of silk and diamonds below him. He looked utterly bored, his dark eyes entirely devoid of warmth. Slowly he began to descend the stairs. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. Bianca Morris shoved her way to the very front of the crowd, adjusting her neckline and pasting on a smile of dazzling, rehearsed perfection. She stood in the direct path of the staircase. Aloysius reached the floor. He walked toward Bianca. Bianca lifted her chin, taking a tiny half-step forward, ready to extend her hand. Aloysius walked right past her. He didn't even blink. He simply stepped around the Earl of Westmoreland's daughter as if she were a misplaced potted plant. A collective, shocked murmur rippled through the aristocracy. Bianca's smile froze, her face turning an ugly, mottled shade of crimson. Aloysius continued walking. He bypassed Lady Sarah Haddington. He ignored the stunningly beautiful daughters of the Marquess of Queensberry. He walked straight toward the dark, draughty corner by the terrace doors. Charlie realized with dawning horror where he was heading. Panic seized her. She pressed her back flat against the cold limestone wall, trying to fuse with the architecture, praying to God she would turn invisible. The crowd parted violently, turning their heads to stare at the back corner. And there, standing before her, was the Duke. Up close, the power he radiated was terrifying. He stopped 2 feet away from Charlie. The entire ballroom held its breath. Charlie could hear the blood roaring in her ears. Aloysius looked at the heavy velvet cloak draped over her arm, the faded gray poplin of her dress, and the sheer terror in her eyes. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in a microscopic private smile. He extended his white-gloved hand toward her. "They are playing a waltz, I believe," Aloysius said, his deep voice carrying clearly in the dead silence of the room. Charlie was paralyzed. She looked at his hand, then up at his face. "Your Grace," she whispered frantically, her voice trembling so badly it nearly cracked. "You do not understand. I am not a guest. I am a companion." "I do not care if you are the chimney sweep, madam," Aloysius replied softly, his eyes locking onto hers with burning intensity. "I asked for a dance." "It is forbidden," she pleaded, tears of sheer panic welling in her eyes. "I will be ruined. Please." "Take my hand," he commanded gently, "and let them try." Slowly, as if in a trance, Charlie let Bianca's cloak slip from her arm. It pooled on the floor in a heap of velvet. She reached out, her bare, trembling hand resting in his large, gloved palm. His fingers closed around hers, warm and resolute. Aloysius pulled her effortlessly from the shadows and led her to the absolute center of the floor. He placed his hand firmly on her waist, drawing her flush against his chest, far closer than societal rules dictated. He nodded to the conductor. The orchestra, shocked into a second of delay, frantically began to play a soaring, dramatic waltz. Aloysius spun her into the music. Charlie gasped, forced to follow his powerful lead. "You deceived me," Charlie whispered fiercely as they swept past a sea of glaring, outraged faces. "You let me speak to you in the pavilion as if you were a normal man. If I had introduced myself as Harrington, you would have curtsied, stared at the floor, and run away 3 minutes earlier," Aloysius countered, spinning her smoothly around the edge of the floor. "Right now, you are the only real person in this room. Everyone else is wearing a mask." "You are making me a target," Charlie said, her heart shattering against her ribs. She could see Bianca glaring at them, looking murderous. "My employer will cast me into the streets tonight. You have effectively ended my life for your amusement." Aloysius's grip on her waist tightened protectively. The amusement vanished from his eyes, replaced by something fierce and immovable. "No one is casting you anywhere. Do you honestly believe I would pull you into the light only to let the wolves tear you apart?" Before Charlie could answer, a sharp, screeching voice cut through the music. "Stop the music." The orchestra staggered to a chaotic squeaking halt. The dancers froze. Bianca Morris stormed onto the center of the floor, abandoning all pretense of aristocratic decorum. She was shaking with rage. She pointed a trembling, white-gloved finger directly at Charlie. "Your Grace, you are being deceived!" Bianca cried out, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You have been away from England. You do not know. This woman is not a lady. She is my servant. She is Charlie Stanton, the daughter of a disgraced thieving merchant who died a pauper in the gutters of London. She is a destitute interloper who has tricked you into this dance." A loud, collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Stanton, the bankrupt merchant, a servant. Good God, the scandal. Charlie felt the floor open up beneath her. The humiliation was a physical agony, a knife twisting directly into her chest. The secrets of her father's ruin, the shame she carried every day, stripped bare and screamed out for the entire British aristocracy to feast upon. She violently tore her hand away from Aloysius's. Miss Stanton, Aloysius started, reaching for her. "Do not touch me!" Charlie choked out. Tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks. She could not breathe. She turned and ran. She picked up the heavy skirts of her faded gray dress and fled across the ballroom floor, running desperately toward the grand mahogany double doors that led to the foyer. The crowd laughed, parting to let the ruined girl flee. She reached the heavy brass handle of the doors, desperate to escape into the night, to run until her lungs bled, to disappear forever. Suddenly, a large hand slammed flat against the mahogany wood right beside her head, forcing the door shut with a deafening crack. Charlie gasped, spinning around. Aloysius stood over her, his chest heaving, his dark eyes blazing with a fury so profound it silenced the entire room. He was practically caging her against the door. Charlie looked up at him, sobbing. "Let me go. Please, let me leave." Aloysius leaned down, his face inches from hers. His voice was low, vibrating with a dark, dangerous promise, loud enough only for her to hear. "I did not give you leave to depart, Miss Stanton." Absolute silence gripped the grand ballroom, thick and suffocating as a wool blanket. Not a single diamond shifted, not a single silk fan fluttered. The entire British aristocracy stood paralyzed, watching the most powerful peer in Berkshire stand as a human shield before a ruined merchant's daughter. Aloysius slowly turned away from the heavy mahogany doors, his broad shoulders shielding Charlie completely from the predatory stares of the crowd. He stepped forward, leaving her safely tucked in the shadows of the foyer entrance, and walked back onto the polished dance floor. He did not rush. Every footfall was deliberate, echoing like a judge's gavel in the cavernous mirrored hall. He stopped a few feet from Bianca Morris, who was still standing in the center of the room, her chest heaving with triumphant malice. She believed she had done him a service. She believed she had saved the Duke of Harrington from a terrible social snare. "Lady Bianca," Aloysius said, his voice deadly quiet, yet carrying effortlessly to the farthest corners of the room. "You have taken it upon yourself to educate me on the subject of Miss Stanton's lineage. You claim her father was a thief." Bianca lifted her chin, emboldened by the gasps of the crowd. "It is a matter of public record, Your Grace. Richard Stanton died owing tens of thousands of pounds to the Baring Brothers Bank. He was a fraud who masqueraded as a gentleman, and his daughter is a parasite attempting to manipulate your generous nature." "A matter of public record," Aloysius repeated softly, tasting the words as if they were poison. He slowly unbuttoned his white gloves, pulling them off one by one. "How fascinating. Because my own solicitors in London have spent the better part of the last 6 months examining those exact records." A subtle, uneasy murmur rippled through the older gentleman in the room. The Earl of Westmoreland, Bianca's father, Lord Reginald Morris, stepped out from the crowd, his face pale, his sideburns twitching nervously. "Your Grace, there is no need to trouble yourself with the sordid financial affairs of a dead commoner. My daughter merely meant to protect the integrity of your house." "Your daughter," Aloysius snapped, his voice suddenly cracking like a whip, "has just insulted the future Duchess of Harrington." The ensuing gasp from the crowd was so violent it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Charlie, still leaning heavily against the brass handles of the door, felt her knees buckle. She clutched the wooden paneling to stay upright, her mind spinning into sheer delirium. "Future Duchess?" Bianca staggered backward, as if physically struck. "Your Grace, you cannot. She is a servant." "She is the daughter of an honorable man who was slaughtered by the greed of this very room," Aloysius roared, his iron composure finally fracturing to reveal a terrifying, volcanic rage. He pointed a bare finger directly at the Earl of Westmoreland. "Did you think I would not find out, Morris? Did you think burying the paperwork in offshore accounts with the Rothschilds would blind me to the truth?" Lord Reginald Morris took a terrified step back, bumping into a marble pillar. I do not know what you mean, Harrington. I am referring to the Colonial Railway venture of 1882, Aloysius said, his tone dropping back to a lethal whisper. The venture championed by Lord Henry Ashford. The venture that ruined the Stanton Shipping Company. Aloysius began to pace, commanding the room with the ruthless authority of a sovereign king. Society believes Richard Stanton embezzled his own investors to fund a failed railway in India. But I hold the original ledgers. I hold the bank drafts signed in Geneva. Richard Stanton never touched a single shilling of that money. Lord Henry Ashford stole the capital, and he split the spoils with 3 silent partners who used the stolen wealth to pay off their own mounting gambling debts and failing estates. Aloysius stopped directly in front of the Earl of Westmoreland, looking down at the trembling man with absolute disgust. "You signed the fraudulent documents, Reginald. You and Ashford drained Stanton's accounts, framed him for the ruin, and then left him to die of a broken heart, while you bought your daughter's silk gowns with his stolen money." Bianca let out a high, thin shriek of horror. She looked frantically at her father, waiting for him to deny it, to strike the Duke for such slander. But Reginald Morris was weeping, his face buried in his trembling hands. "My God," whispered the Duchess of Marlborough from the front row. The scandal was absolute. It was total annihilation. For 3 weeks, Aloysius continued, turning his dark, furious gaze upon Bianca, you have treated Miss Stanton as your personal footstool. You forced the rightful heir of a vast shipping empire to mend your hems and carry your cloaks, all while wearing jewels bought with her father's blood. "Please, your grace," Reginald begged, falling to his knees on the polished floor. "I will repay it. I will secure a loan from the Bank of England." "You will do nothing of the sort," Aloysius said coldly, "because yesterday afternoon I purchased every single one of your outstanding promissory notes from the Baring brothers. I own your debts, Morris. I own your townhouse on Grosvenor Square. I own the carriages in your stables. By tomorrow morning, you will be entirely bankrupt." Aloysius signaled to the 2 massive footmen standing by the grand staircase. "Escort the Earl of Westmoreland and his daughter from my property. They are no longer recognized in polite society. If they set foot in Berkshire again, I will have them arrested for fraud." "No!" Bianca screamed, her perfect facade crumbling into a grotesque mask of panic. "You cannot do this! I am a lady of the realm! You cannot ruin us for a companion!" "She is not a companion," Aloysius said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "She is Charlie Stanton, and she is under my absolute protection." The footman seized Lord Reginald by the arms, dragging the sobbing man out through the side galleries. Bianca was ushered out behind him, shrieking hysterically until the heavy oak doors muffled her cries. The ballroom was locked in a stunned, breathless silence. The sheer brutality of the Duke's financial execution had left the most powerful families in England trembling. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Aloysius did not care about them. He turned his back on the glittering, terrified crowd and walked straight back to the shadows by the mahogany doors. Charlie was trembling violently, her chest rising and falling in shallow, frantic breaths. Tears were streaming down her pale face, her gray poplin dress stark against the opulent surroundings. She looked at Aloysius as if he were a mythical creature, a terrifying, avenging angel who had just set the world on fire for her sake. Aloysius stopped in front of her. The blazing fury in his eyes vanished the second he looked at her, replaced by a profound, agonizing tenderness. He gently offered her his arm. "The air in here has grown entirely toxic," Aloysius murmured, keeping his voice so low that only she could hear. "Come with me, Charlie." She did not hesitate. She placed her trembling hand in the crook of his arm, and together, the Duke of Harrington and the ruined merchant's daughter walked out of the grand ballroom, leaving the British aristocracy entirely in their wake. Aloysius led Charlie through a labyrinth of quiet, dimly lit corridors, far away from the oppressive hum of the ballroom. They entered a sprawling, oak-paneled private study located in the west wing of Oakhaven. A massive fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow over the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the rich burgundy leather armchairs. Aloysius locked the heavy double doors behind them with a definitive click. He guided Charlie to a chair by the fire, then moved to a crystal decanter on a silver tray. He poured a generous measure of amber brandy and pressed the glass into her shaking hands. "Drink," he commanded softly. "It will stop the trembling." Charlie took a sip. The liquid burned a fiery path down her throat, settling the icy shock that had gripped her chest. She looked up at him, her mind struggling to process the cataclysmic events of the past 10 minutes. "How?" Charlie whispered, her voice raw. "How could you possibly know about my father? About Lord Ashford? Why would the Duke of Harrington care about a ruined merchant? Aloysius pulled up a velvet footstool and sat down directly in front of her, disregarding every rule of spatial propriety. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a heavy, sorrowful weight. "Because your father was not the only man Lord Henry Ashford murdered," Aloysius said quietly. Charlie gasped softly, lowering the brandy glass. 5 years ago, Aloysius continued, the silver scar on his brow catching the firelight, my older brother, Thomas, was the Duke of Harrington. He was a brilliant, trusting man, much like your father. He accompanied Ashford on a diplomatic trip to Vienna. While there, Thomas discovered Ashford was forging state bonds and embezzling funds from the crown. Aloysius looked away, staring into the roaring flames as the bitter memories surfaced. Before Thomas could send a missive back to London, Ashford orchestrated a scandal. He cornered Thomas at a private card game, accused him of cheating, and challenged him to a duel at dawn. Ashford was a renowned marksman. Thomas was a scholar who had never fired a pistol in anger. Ashford shot him through the heart before the second could even drop the handkerchief. "Oh, Aloysius," Charlie breathed, the informal name slipping from her lips without thought. Her heart broke for the severe, brooding man in front of her. She reached out, her small fingers gently resting on the sleeve of his black evening coat. Aloysius looked down at her hand, a muscle feathering in his jaw. "I spent the last 5 years in Austria and Switzerland, tearing apart every financial institution on the continent to find the proof of Ashford's corruption. When I finally acquired his secret ledgers from a corrupt banker in Zurich, I found the truth about my brother. But I also found the records of the Stanton Shipping Company." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of parchment. He carefully handed it to Charlie. She unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a bank draft from the Baring brothers, transferring £50,000. At the bottom, next to her father's forged signature, was a secondary note written in Reginald Morris's handwriting, detailing the split of the stolen funds. "I swore to destroy every man whose name was in that ledger," Aloysius said fiercely. "Ashford is currently rotting in a debtor's prison in France on my orders. But when I returned to England to deal with Morris, I discovered what had happened to you. I hired Pinkerton agents to find Richard Stanton's daughter. For 3 weeks they scoured London, looking for a woman cast into the streets. Because I was hiding in plain sight," Charlie realized, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I was living in the very house of the man who ruined me. When I saw you standing in the glass pavilion tonight," Aloysius murmured, reaching up to gently brush the tear from her face with his thumb, looking at the queen of the night flower, "I knew exactly who you were. My agents had found a portrait of you from a gallery in Mayfair. I knew your face, Charlie, but I did not expect." He trailed off, his voice dropping to a raw, breathless whisper. "I did not expect the sheer force of you. I did not expect you to look at me in the dark and see right through the title, right to the ghost underneath." Charlie leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as a sob caught in her throat. For 2 years, she had been invisible. She had been a ghost, a piece of furniture, a punching bag for a cruel world. And now, the most powerful man in England was kneeling before her, looking at her as if she were the only breathing creature on earth. "You called me the future Duchess of Harrington in front of the entire ton," Charlie whispered, opening her eyes to meet his piercing gaze. "You engineered a magnificent piece of theater to protect me, Your Grace. But you do not have to marry me out of pity, or out of a shared need for vengeance. You have given me my father's honor back. That is more than enough." Aloysius let out a low, rough laugh, though there was no humor in it, only a desperate, fierce possessiveness. "Pity?" he repeated, his hands coming up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "Charlie, you possess more strength in your little finger than every aristocrat in that ballroom combined. You survived the absolute worst of this vicious society and emerged with your mind sharp and your heart intact. I am not offering you my title out of pity. I am offering it because I am a profoundly selfish man, and I refuse to let you leave this house." He leaned in closer, his breath ghosting over her lips. The grandfather clock in the distant hallway began to chime. Gong. Stay with me, Aloysius pleaded, the authoritative Duke vanishing, leaving only a man asking for salvation. Bong. Let me buy back your father's ships. Let me put your name back on the Grosvenor Square registry. Bong. Rule this estate with me. Be my duchess. Be my equal. Charlie looked into his dark, desperate eyes, seeing the same loneliness she had carried for 2 years reflected back at her. She reached up, weaving her fingers into his thick, dark hair. I do not care about the ships, Aloysius, Charlie whispered, her heart soaring as the final bell of midnight began to chime. I only care about you. As the clock struck 12, signaling the end of the midsummer ball, Aloysius Gonzalez pulled Charlie Stanton into his arms and kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of vindication, of ash and ruin rebuilt into empire, and of a fiercely burning love that had bloomed entirely in the dark. By morning, the high society of London would erupt into a frenzy of scandal, lawsuits, and shock. The Morris family would flee to the countryside in absolute disgrace, their debts exposed and their cruelty punished. But inside the heavily guarded walls of Oakhaven Manor, safe by the roaring fire, the Duke and his new Duchess did not care about the whispers of the world outside. The shadow had finally stepped into the light, and she would never be invisible again. Did this scandalous midnight waltz leave you breathless? The world of historical romance is filled with hidden secrets, dramatic ruin, and gentlemen who would burn high society to the ground for the women they love. If you were captivated by Charlie and Aloysius's triumphant defiance and want to uncover more thrilling tales of forbidden love and ultimate vengeance, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking stories.